everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katrina Lashley. I am Program Coordinator here at Anacostia Community Museum in Washington, D.C. And this is our fourth Community Forum of the month. We've had a month-long celebration of women's environmental justice leadership. And so we're very excited to have our final discussion with our very distinguished guest of panelists today. The future is here. And so I want to quickly give you an overview of today's events. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work the museum's been doing for the past 10 years or so. I'll introduce our moderator and we'll get started as soon as possible. So for the past decade or so, the museum has been engaged in the Urban Waterways Project, which has documented and explored the relationship between urban communities and their urban waterways, their rivers, by extension, their natural resources. And so the project approaches this work from this framework that communities and their urban waterways share not only physical space, but they also share this ongoing history. And that community members are willing to engage in these issues surrounding their waterways and their environment. Are they already engaged in these issues? Are they being prevented from engaging in these issues for a variety of reasons? If we're looking at this from a relationship perspective, we have to really understand the entire story and history of these communities and the waterways from every possible angle. So our goal really is to engage anyone who's interested in these topics from history, culture, race, power, class, economics, justice, what have you, and to create a space where everyone feels welcomed to share their experiences and to also share their expertise. And as we were doing the work, programming, documentation, exhibition, we're meeting various community collaborators from locally and also nationally and also internationally. I mean, lots of women who are also engaged in this work and leading these various environmental spaces. Some of these women were starting out in their careers. They're entering from undergrad, grad work. They were mid-career. Some women have been in this field for decades, 30, 40, 50 years. And many of them have actually shaped the very spaces in which they work and actually, I would say, pushed the boundaries or the definitions of environment and environmentalism. And so I was very intrigued in bringing these women into conversation with each other around the themes of mentorship, education, training, and also leadership. We see these women as very much a living history, the embodiment of the history of this movement. And as they're doing the work, they're also adding to, contributing to this history. And so we launched in 2018 with a national summit and community forum. And the goal was to have women meet as not only professionals, but also as people. And so in 2019, we continued our programming. We had a second summit, and through the support of Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative, we also added programming such as workshops during discussions. We had in 2019 a series of oral histories, and we used 6 of those oral histories in the creation of a publication aimed at late, middle, early high school called Women, Environmentalism, and Justice. This idea of engaging as many age groups as possible in discussions, connections to this idea of environmentalism, stewardship, and the various ways that women can enter and lead and work in these spaces. And so moving forward into 2020, with the world going virtual, we launched a series of lectures last fall, and we've continued our virtual engagement with a month-long celebration of community forums, and we'll continue into the spring and summer with another series of lectures. And so today's event really is the culmination of a month discussion, really kind of looking at how women not only work in these environmental spaces, but also how they've shaped these spaces and will continue to shape these spaces. We started the month of a celebration, really, a look back at a seminal movement in the EJ movement, but also say in terms of the environmental movement as a whole. Almost 30 years ago, we're not quite in October yet, we in DC, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was held. We had an opportunity for communities of color to gather to reaffirm their connection to the earth and to also reaffirm their ongoing legacies of stewardship of their communities. They also reclaimed their right to the spaces in which they lived, but also in the spaces where decisions were being made and policy was being developed that would directly impact their quality of life and the quality of lives of the people that they cared about and the people that they were advocating for. And so really it was a moment of solidarity where communities of colors kind of gathered to really codify the 17 principles that would guide their work and that have continued to guide shape their work throughout time. And it also expanded narratives of the environment to kind of reconnect this definition of environment as this ongoing relationship between the earth, the natural world, and humankind itself. And so we're very fortunate in the first community forum to meet with women who were part of this event, who helped us shape the event, who were working and who had continued to work in these environmental spaces over time. And as the month moved on, we're looking at the present. What are the issues impacting communities today? Who's doing the work in these various fields, and how the work of these women have once again challenged and redefined the issues that communities were facing, the histories of these communities, and also the histories of these issues, and also the realization that these issues are very much intersectional as well as they're also historical. We didn't get to this moment by chance. And so taking a step back and saying, how do we get to this point in time? How everything intersects, but also what are the historical roots of the realities in which we live, the communities in which we live, and how any meaningful way of addressing these environmental issues has to come with an acknowledgement of the intersectionality and historical kind of frameworks in which communities live and also in which they're advocating. And also today is a step, I think, to not only focus on the present, but also to look at the future. The one that we've gathered here today in our conversation are asking us to really kind of continue to expand our definitions of environmentalism. How do we kind of conceive of our relationship with the environment? How do we express this relationship? What new languages are we trying to use? But also, how do we think about this idea of policy, development frameworks? How do we provide protection and access to these various environmental spaces? And so I think in the conversation that we're about to have, we're going to see how these women are very much influenced by the past and those working in the present, but also as we look to the future, they will continue to expand these environmental frameworks, definitions, and spaces. And so we're very fortunate today to be guided and led in conversation by a moderator, Tamara Toles O'Loughlin. She is an international climate strategist and environmental advocate focused on people and planet. Her niche in environmental work is developing capacity building programs and creating multimedia campaigns to dismantle privilege and increase opportunities for vulnerable populations to access health, air, clean energy, and a toxic-free economy at a local, regional, and international region. Among her many activities, Tamara is the co-chair of the Green Leadership Trust, which builds a more powerful environmental movement by expanding the impact and leadership of people of color, indigenous people, serving on U.S. environmental nonprofit boards. She's also a member of the World Economic Forum, National Cities Executive Working Group. She serves as the chairwoman of the board of directors of Women's Voices, which works to disrupt industry standards by forcing ingredient disclosure and the elimination of toxic chemicals from personal care products. Most recently, Tamara was a former North American director of 350.org, where she drove regional strategy in the United States and Canada. As a leader of 350's programming, she led mission critical work and organizational investments to build a multiracial, multi-generational climate movement capable of holding leaders accountable to science and justice. She serves on the advisory board of Climate Power 2020 and is a member of political sustainability forum, The Long Game, which provides insight on issues of climate change and social responsibility. She graduated from Vermont Law School in 2009, with a Juris Doctor and Master of Environmental Law and Policy for concentration in energy generation and carbon constraint. And so Tamara, I'm very happy to turn the stage over to you and to have you introduce our panel. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for just being such a great architect of this conversation over the course of a month. Before we got started, I mentioned to Katrina that it's a rare place that actually walks the walk and talks the talk. Everybody cares about women's voices, about women's rights to life, about women's issues until they have to do something. And so it's just really a sign of Katrina's leadership that this month has been a celebration of how women show up in lots of spaces, how we aid, support, and lead these fights happening everywhere. It is my pleasure to moderate a panel of, I have happily called it a panel of genius, so I get to be the moderator of genius today. I'm going to introduce you to three folks who are just making change happen everywhere. My pleasure to introduce Erica Dickerson Dispenza, a Black queer feminist poet, playwright, and cultural memory worker from Chicago. Let that sit with you. Black, queer, feminist, poet, playwright, and cultural memory worker with numerous awards, fellowships, and community. Among them, Erica has been awarded the Susan Smith Blackburn was a prize finalist, the Lawrence Hatcher Foundation Award, the Thomas Award, the Lilly Award, and among others. As a fellow, Erica is currently a Toe playwright in residence at the Public Theater, or was from 2019 to 2020, U.S. Water Alliance National Arts and Cultural Delegate in 2019, a New York Stage Film and Fellow in Residence in the same year, among many other places. Erica's communities include the BYP 100 Squad, ARS Nova Play Group, the Youngblood Collective, and as well as commissions on climate change and theater action, the Public Theater, Williamstown Theater Festival, and many productions. Currently, Erica is developing a 10-play Katrina cycle, including Hieroglyph, Shadow, and Land focused on the effects of Hurricane Katrina and its state-sanctioned man-made disaster status rippling in and beyond New Orleans. If you can't feel that, I don't know what you can feel. There's so much going on. Erica's clearly an activist, an agitator, someone who shows up and makes the site of their resistance where they are. I'm also happy to be in conversation today with Sakita Grant, an environmental policy and social justice strategist who recently joined the Solutions Project as the VP of Programs, overseeing their grant making, policy and research, impact and strategy support for more than 100 frontline leaders, innovating in models for a regenerative economy across the community, including Puerto Rico. We can't forget the territories, especially not today. She is an environmental justice lecturer at Sacramento State University. Sakita has been a consultant supporting change makers and equitable climate policy and narratives. She worked previously as a climate justice fellow with the Emerson Collective and recently completed a fellowship with the Florida Sea Grant and the University of Florida's Conservation Clinic. Prior to that, Sakita worked as a policy and impact strategy manager in that role at the Emerson Collective and helped to catalyze new approaches to scaling the environmental and social good offering through climate and environmental policies and projects. Prior to Emerson Collective, Sakita worked as the Greenlining Institute's legal counsel on their environmental equity team. In that role, she worked to make energy and climate policies in California equitable and beneficial to communities of color. She came to Greenlining from Business for Social Responsibility, where she worked as a sustainability and human rights consultant to large corporations. Scale, everybody. Along her journey, Sakita has also worked as a policy advisor at the California Energy Commission in Sacramento. There, she served as the lead advisor to the chair on climate, transportation, and legal matters. So much robust capacity here. Finally, last but not least, Karina Newsom is the community engagement manager for the Georgia Audubon and a biology master's student at Georgia Southern University studying avian conservation. Having experienced the hurdles faced by Black, Indigenous, people of color interested in wildlife careers, she has founded several programs to engage high school students from underrepresented demographics to consider careers in wildlife sciences. We can't have people in planet if we don't have planet, which requires an ecosystem that's healthy. Way to go, Karina. Karina's mission is to center the perspectives and leadership of historically marginalized communities in wildlife conservation, environmental education, and exploration of the natural world. It is my distinct pleasure to be in conversation with each of you. I fear that the time will roll by quickly, so I'll do my best to try to shepherd us. I'd like to ask some questions and then we'll open it up for Q&A from other folks. So if feel free to come off mic, this will be like a conversation. Let's start with a question for all of the change makers in this room. Please tell everyone who's watching about your community. Specifically, who are you in your community? What are you fighting for? And how has that shaped your understanding of and connection to environment and the work of justice? And just to avoid making it difficult to hear, we'll start with the person to my right, which is Karina on my screen. So tell us about your community.
All right, thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here. And I do want to give honor to Katrina for putting all of this phenomenal conversation and learning experiences together, and to Mara, to you for organizing. It's an honor to be among these incredible panelists. And I have already learned so much from all of you. And so I'm grateful to be here among you. So I am originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, grew up in Germantown, if there's anyone from the Philadelphia area here. And my world is full of women. My household was an all-woman household. Many of my mentors and my teachers were women. And so I come from a background and a community of people, of women in particular, who somehow have been able to hold fierce hustle, fierce protection of their people, fierce protection of the things, the places, and the people that they care about, and incredible tenderness at the same time. They've been able to hold the endurance in the face of mind-blowing violence and incredible joy at the same time. And I've been a product of a very dynamic environment, a very dynamic group of leader women in my life who have, despite the fact that my interests were pretty unique in my community, being very focused on wildlife and the outdoors and natural sciences, particularly because I was in an urban jungle growing up. who stood by me even when they didn't necessarily understand where my passion came from necessarily, or why I was particularly interested in the field of science that I was. They stood by me, they supported me, and they fought for me the entire way, and they continue to fight for me today. And so the person that I try to be in my community is the women who brought me here. I try to essentially follow in their footsteps and to carry the mantle and to be for the next generation of women and people who the previous generation was for me. And so in my community, I attempt in every way that I can to show up in exactly that capacity. And when it comes to essentially what I'm fighting for, being both from a low-income background, being from a strongly urban environment, I've been able to necessarily have an intersectional perspective when it comes to my work in environmental science. And I think when people come from communities that are presently and historically oppressed, you have to have an intersectional perspective to survive. And so it's not because I'm some sort of great scholar or some sort of great social scientist that I have this perspective, simply because that's what you need to survive. But being in a space that is largely white, that is largely cisgendered male, that is largely people with capital, with power, my perspective and my job, but I've made it my passion and work to do, is to redistribute the power, to redistribute the capital, the money that has been held up and essentially used for the purposes, for the visions of this white majority, to redistribute it to the organizations, the people, the communities, the neighborhoods who are closest to the pain. One of my favorite quotes is from Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, and she said, "The people who are closest to the pain need to be closest to the power." And my work in environmental science is to make sure that the people who are closest to the pain are in power, are in control of the capital, in control of the decisions. And so that's a little background on the community that I come from and the way that I want to show up in the spaces that I occupy.
Thank you so much. Erica, would you answer the question, who are you in your community, and bring us into your community? Give us some visuals that we can take so that we're going with you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karina, for sharing. Thank you, Katrina, for the invitation to sit amongst such brilliant women who look like me. We don't get to gather across discipline and across our corner of the work as often as I would like. And so this is an absolute blessing. Who am I in my communities? It's a very Ella Baker question, right? I have to tell you who my people are in order for you to understand who I am. And so I was born and raised on the west side of Chicago. So shout out to East Garfield Park and Humboldt Park, places where Fred Hampton organized, where the Young Lords organized. Fred Hampton and I have the same birthday, and his people are also from Louisiana. I would say he is one of my first socialist teachers, just in my literal neighborhood, the history that is there. Paternally, my people are from New Orleans, have been there since at least 1863. Special shout out to the 3rd Ward and the 8th Ward, respectively. My mother's people are from Maven, Mississippi, having been stolen from Cameroon of the Bamileke tribe, and journeyed to Chicago. My people are also from Birmingham, have been there since the late 1800s. My people are my sorors of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. My teachers in the way of abolition, healing, and visions of new worlds include Toni K. Bambara, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, June Jordan, Octavia Butler, and Kara Page. My feminist and womanist literary mothers and aunts, women who have taught me and continue to teach me beyond the veil in the ways of organizing cultural work, cultural memory work, include Ntozake Shange, first and foremost. Toni Morrison, Toni K. Bambara, Lorraine Hansberry, Zorno Hurston, Ida B. Rose Barnett, Fred Hampton. The Kambahi River Collective, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Alice Childress. And my spiritual fortitude is only because of the work of Anna Julia Cooper, who teaches us when and where I enter as a Black woman, then and there, right? The late Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, the late Reverend Dr. Krathia Hall, who gave King the dream, Reverend Dr. James Cone, Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, and I'm held currently, political homes are important, spiritual homes are also important. And home is a people, not just a place, right? Not just a space. And so Minister Candace Simpson and Reverend Dr. Nichelle Guidry at Spelman, she is currently serving there as their chaplain dean. And so when I think about who all of these people are, were, continue to be in whatever sphere they are in currently, my people are visionaries, and therefore I am called to vision. My people are resilient, and therefore I am called to resilience. My people have cleared the way and built things. Therefore, I am a builder of things and people. My people are wildcrafters, and so I am called to be in right relationship with the earth and to steward my resources of all kinds well. My people are lovers and daughters and mothers. I too come from a family of predominantly women, women who were leaders in various capacities in their various geographical locations. And I see my job very much in the vein of creating the abolitionist world we aspire to right now. Minister Candace Simpson, who is also like my very good friend and soror, would say, I believe that we can create heaven on earth right now, right? And so when I talk abolition at the very basic level, what I mean is how do we be in better and right relationship with each other and the earth, that there is another way to exist and there is another way to be together. And that way is freer. There are other worlds that are freer that we have yet to tap into. And so that is my work. And through that work, I am aspiring to be in alignment with the mandate that Mary Hooks, formerly of Southerners on New Ground, gave us, right? Like the mandate for Black people in this time to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and to be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. And so everything that I do in terms of my cultural work, in terms of my artistic work, when I'm popping back into direct organizing when, is in service to that and abolition. So yeah.
Well, it's just the beginning of the conversation, but that's a word we could close, and I would feel like we did some stuff. You saw these faces, you heard this pedigree of people who are just so deep in their communities. If you need more, hang out. But like, I'm just releasing you if you feel like you've already had so much. Sakita, can you talk to us a little bit about your community and who you are in that community, and really help us to understand your connection to environment and work of justice in it?
Yes, my vibes are so elevated right now. Just all of y'all are just spitting poetry. I feel so inspired, and just it's an honor to be here. And again, a shout out to Katrina for the invitation. I hope this is the beginning of more conversations with y'all. I'm really excited to learn and be in community. So yes, you all are my community. You know, a little bit about my background. So my people are from, most immediately, the last few generations from South America, from Guyana. And my parents immigrated through the East Coast to the Bay Area in California, which is where I grew up, and tons of family just really ingrained in the Bay Area community, a community that is embraces, I think, a lot of the multidisciplinary, integrated ways of thinking, a lot of strong history. Thank you for bringing in Fred Hampton to this conversation. You know, Oakland has a strong, deep roots around Black organizing, around the Black Panther Party, and really kind of, I think, really seeded for me a big core part of my personality, which is curiosity, and just being a student of this work, and kind of having this insatiable pursuit of truth. I say truth with a capital T. And not just the discovery of that truth, but the protection of it, and really finding ways for us to design society and the way that we interact with each other and the way we interact with Mother Earth around those truths. I also embody courage because that's what my ancestors call me to do. And so through Guyana, my ancestors are from West Africa. They're from indigenous peoples of South America, and as well as in Europe, in Madeira, an island off the coast of Morocco. And so the work that I am called to do, really, Karina, I think you spoke a lot to this, which is understanding this value point that those that are closest to these issues, those that are closest to the pain points, are also the most brilliant innovators. And so that is kind of the foundation of my work. And so the work that I do at the Solutions Project is really looking at how do we support through resources. We also work in communications and media, but supporting grassroots advocates and advocacy that is innovating at the front lines of the climate crisis, environmental justice crisis. And you know, the work that comes out, this is really heavy work, but the work that comes out of the often women leaders that are doing this healing work is incredibly inspiring, right? There's just so much innovation that's happening, and that helps me to feel very optimistic, I guess, in times that feel, you know, pretty like unwieldy, like that what we are being challenged with. And then also, you know, in that capital T truth, just we'll probably get into that, is really emphasizing the root causes of issues. This for me keeps me grounded as well. Grounding in the root causes of issues, and therefore the radical solutions to address those root causes, which are solutions that come from communities that are at the forefront of these issues. So those are some things that come to mind as I hear folks speak, and just really excited to dig in and yeah, continue sharing and learning.
Well, I'd say that we're already aligned, the frequency. There's some real themes coming through about, like, I think the idea of intersectionality coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, like, was a watershed moment for people's consciousness in an academic sense. And then her work continues to figure out how we operationalize it. But some of us are born in that nexus. We can't choose between our identities or the ways that we are treated by other people. We cannot segregate the oppression from the suppression or the ways forward and the solutions, because our bodies are literally the crossroads. That is the intersection of these things. I have said to many folks that I would be cold chilling in West Africa. You know, if I were left to my own devices. My body was moved here. My people have been on Turtle Island since 1536, and not by my own choice. So we have no choice but to reckon with all of these different things, the stuff that's good, the stuff that's bad, because like every other color comes from Blackness, we have to absorb all of it. We are the site of resistance. There is not a single revolution that happens if we are not in it, if we are not powering it, if we don't build it, if we don't design it. And so it is really incredible to be in this conversation about how our journeys are so towards the same goals amongst many others who are doing the same and a part of a long-term history. People talk about the long arc of justice. Norma Wong talks about us holding our part of that arc. Like arcs other than ones you draw aren't self-sustaining. So each of us is holding up a piece of that arc. I'd like to ask another question of the whole group, because it's just fun to go around. Please come off mute, because our bodies, our hands, we're making, like, we're in a conversation, and we want to make sure people aren't left out of that. As we face down this compound crisis, the month of speakers has included the woman who taught me the word syndemic, Vernice Miller Travis. The idea that there are so many pandemics at once. We had our usage of this word. We learned it in the 80s during the HIV/AIDS crisis, where any number of present conditions in the human body could kill a person, right? Because it was all under attack. So a syndemic is multiple pandemics. We are in a racial pandemic. We are in a climate crisis. We are in a crisis of conscience, and whether or not America 3.0 will reel its head, or whether we'll move through to another thing. Can each of you talk about what do you see from your perch in this place as the critical access points of opportunity, engagement, advocacy, or activism that could really spark change in the community that you come from? Because nobody has the view that you have. And we'll start with Karina.
Thank you so much. When I tell you, man, I'm like looking for the offering plate. I'm trying to figure out how I can I'm sweating, I'm shaking. This is just so empowering, and I'm already just so uplifted. So thank you to all of you for all of your words. So when I think about this question, of course, I come immediately back to Mara, as you said, to intersectionality. What I've seen as a biologist working very closely in the realms of like wildlife management, sustainability, that kind of academic space, and even just being an observer and a member of a community that is essentially at the mercy, has been for a long time at the mercy of the whims of white supremacy. The solutions that we craft, whether we're talking about the climate crisis, sustainability, clean energy, wildlife management, species management for endangered and threatened species, any of these kind of problems that have resulted from the environmental emergency that we find ourselves in, the solutions can and have victimized the same people who were the victims of the original sin, right? The original exploitation of the land and of people. And coming into a space like wildlife management, which again is extremely dominated by white men with land and power, I was originally so very discouraged to see that there was no one checking this space, checking the decisions that were being made, because it was so isolated from the people who were, again, victimized by the original and current exploitation of people and earth. And so one of the critical points for advocacy, I think, in the spaces that I occupy, particularly in wildlife management, in wildlife viewing, outdoor recreation, things like that, is critically assessing the ways in which the solutions are and might in the future victimize the same communities. And that requires intersectional perspective, that requires interdisciplinary problem solving. And one of my mentors and one of the women who I look up to greatly, her name is Nataki Osborne-Jelks, and she's here, you know her? Yeah.
Wow, yes.
A revolution in herself, like in her own right? She does a lot of research academically, as well as like program formation around the intersection of justice and environmentalism and sustainability and all these things. She has been a force at the front lines of really calling to accountability these systems of problem solving, and has really called for, especially in the Atlanta area where she is and where I am, has really called our leadership to having an interdisciplinary method to problem solving, right? Like you think about, for example, when we think about green space and who has access to green space, right? A lot of the people in power will hear, yeah, like, our urban environments, our low income areas don't have limited access to green space and outdoor enjoyment. So let's make the green spaces better. Let's enhance them, without thinking at all about how that will end up displacing those very people who are meant to be enjoying the spaces, right? So this green gentrification. And to kind of combat that, one of the things that Dr. Osborne-Jelks has been talking about is we need to have people who are in public health, who are in housing, who are in parks design, who are in wildlife conservation, not operating in silos, but working together and centering and following the leadership of the communities themselves, of the neighborhood associations, of the organizations, of the leadership of those communities who have been displaced and victimized again and again and again. And even thinking about, like, specifically about species management and wildlife conservation of threatened and endangered species. This has been, this pattern has been happening both here in Turtle Island, United States, and around the world. Like, we've been following the powers that are currently in place have been following the pattern of colonialism in wildlife conservation, right? So we say, okay, the exploitation that has been driven by white settler mindset and culture has created this environmental emergency, but to fix it, we're going to push the people who are already victimized off their land in order to protect this, few endangered species. And what that does is, or what they don't realize rather, is that when you push people further into desperation, your wildlife management isn't even going to work. Like, when you continue to victimize people, you can't even save the wildlife. So you have to not only have an intersectional understanding, you have to center and prioritize the needs and the perspective and the knowledge and the creativity of the people who are there, because they have the best answers, they have the best solutions, they have the best perspective to bringing these solutions to reality. I'll stop there. I feel like I could talk forever about this. About fantastic. This, you know what I mean? So that's kind of where my mind tends to be on that issue.
I'm so glad you brought up all the great folks who are building the urban forests in the middle of Georgia. There's just so much good work that we are actively doing. It is not always called out. People don't see it if it's not interfacing with them. But this question of how do we interface with the natural world? How do we reckon with conservation in general? I have been known to say some fairly intentionally blasphemous things about conservation and whether or not its best use would be to reduce its wealth to the point of closure and then returning its resources back to community, right? So I'm just going to out myself and say that like the end game for me is that we redesign the things we have designed, thinking through whether or not the decisions that we inherited are the decisions we want to make somebody else's inheritance. And on that note, Sakita, you want to jump in before?
Beautiful. Yes. So rich. When I was reflecting on this question, really or achieving accessibility to these issues through a mindset of knowing, which I think, Karina, you brought us into a space of decolonizing our minds and really having clarity about what I was referring to as that truth, right? As the truth around kind of what is an illusion of some of the more dominant white-led spaces of environmentalism and the conservation space, which is one that I studied previously, is, as you said, so entrenched in certain ways of approaching issues that are just reinforcing the same wrongs. Going in to buy land and trying to put a price tag on nature and, doing these things that, we've been trying it for a long time. This is why I tell folks, listen, it's not working. So why not try something different, right? Why not look at, the intersectionality with, environmental racism? Why not, connect in a deep way with our Indigenous brothers and sisters here on Turtle Island to understand a new way of getting into right relationship with our environment. And so to really, and to have a scientific community, a body of knowledge that is complete and that is rigorous. And that means it can't just be something that's created by a PhD and it sits on a shelf somewhere, but it is the collective knowledge that we have as Indigenous people and people of color as well. And so bringing us to, I think, a stronger way of addressing the issues. A lot of times if I'm advocating or working, especially in the climate space, and folks will say, totally get the racial justice thing, it's terrible, we need to fix that, but this is really urgent over here. This climate change thing is more urgent, so we need to wait. And for me, I know you have the answers to the test wrong, because if you think that these issues are not connected, you don't understand the root causes of climate change. You do not have climate change without sacrifice zones. You do not have sacrifice zones without racial hierarchies and social hierarchies, right? Period. So if you want to really address climate change and not simply
dress it up,
not simply just kind of, not simply just really first and foremost try to protect the incumbent and try to protect the status quo, and then secondarily see as much as you could get on climate change, but really radically get to the root of the causes and address it. That means you are in deep relationship and understanding with violence against Black bodies. You are in deep relationship and understanding of the attempts to erase Indigenous communities from their homeland in Turtle Island, right? You are working in those spaces as ways to heal the relationships humans have with each other, and therefore healing the relationship we have with Mother Earth. So that mindset of knowing for me feels like a really important part of accessibility. And then look for solutionaries. I mean, y'all are this panel, and then all of the brilliant minds that y'all are bringing into this spaces, and your community. What's going on in your community? I know wherever you live that there are great grassroots groups and leaders that are organizing to protect, heal, the environment and the people living there, and to connect with them and learn and be involved. And then the last thing I'll say is to get in where you fit in, right? What is your calling? What are you drawn toward? Is it sitting and researching? Is it, being able to get on a bullhorn and speak? Is it through your artistic talents? Is it, what is it? And just go all in, with really leading with your heart in these spaces, because we need you urgently. We need you. So I'll stop there.
Erica, can you talk to us about the critical access points? Because what I think is getting really getting lifted up here is that our different views, if you don't have the right vision, you can't see the solutions in front of you. And this is the problem with homogeneity in the work. This is the problem with systems of oppression, is that it silos people, so then the only thing you can see are things you're focused on. It's why metrics and magic both need to be a part of what we are doing and how we see people. So I would love to hear from you about what are the critical access points that you see that other folks might not, because until we get them all, we won't have the broad movement it takes to win.
Absolutely. So I just want to lift up Audre Lorde's this quote in Sister Outsider. She says, "Sometimes we are blessed with being able to choose the time and the arena and the manner of our revolution. But more usually we do battle where we are standing," right? And so not all of us are standing in the sciences. Not all of us are standing in the grassroots direct, action world. I have even shifted roles a bit more because of illnesses and where I'm doing battle in this moment and how effective I feel like I can be, right? And so I'm prefacing my answer about these critical access points with just a brief story of how I got there, right? So in 2016, BYP 100, Chicago BYP 100 chapter was leading the Buy Anita campaign, right? And so there was a direct action that was blocking the entrance of the Homan Square police torture site, where they have disappeared and abused, hundreds of Black and brown people from the Lawndale neighborhood. Lawndale is on the west side, and big up to the west side, because when people think of Chicago and Black people, for some reason, the entire west side is erased or invisibilized in that conversation, when it is and has been a robust Black community, right? Like Lawndale is the place that Dr. King came and lived while fighting for housing rights, right, on the west side of Chicago. And so there's this action that BYP 100 leads that the Let Us Breathe Collective supports. And so the Let Us Breathe Collective is a Chicago-based alliance of artists and activists organizing through a creative lens to imagine a world without police and prison. And I am pushing that political home of mine, one of a few, to also include abolitionist ecology, because following that direct action in 2016, literally, we are in front of the Homan Square police torture site, and then those of us of the Let Us Breathe Collective took over the vacant lot across the street, directly across the street, and there are many on the west side and south side of Chicago in these Black neighborhoods, right? And so we created an abolitionist laboratory after that particular direct action, and for 41 days fed the community and imagined, literally by doing, what does a world without police and prisons look like? So how do we do conflict, right? This is 2016, so it's not as popular a concept in the millennial generation quite yet, right? This is on the heels of what was the burgeoning, Ferguson Rebellion and the Baltimore Rebellion, right? These are the beginning years of these organizations that have grown and blossomed and had other twists and turns that we are currently, experiencing as
evolution,
as political homes, right? And so 41-day overnight occupation of this empty lot. We had a theater troupe come out. We had a free library full of radical Black books, right? We had programming for the kids, and we fed the community 3 times a day. A lot of things happened, and that was a very hard imagining project, right? This abolitionist laboratory. But what I look back and see was us doing some really radical placemaking and thinking about the abolitionist ecological opportunity that lies in these vacant lots of Black neighborhoods. And so we gave freedom a geography. How do we literally practice the world that we are saying we are organizing and fighting for? And that was a time that we did that. And yet we did not directly connect the abolitionist ecological aspect of what we were doing in that time, right? And so I'm like, oh, what are the critical access points for connecting the prison and police abolitionists who are doing such beautiful work and have been like OGs to newcomers to the EJ movement? And this is not, like, this hasn't been done before. Like, there have been Black people and other people of the global majority who have been doing both of that work. Like, if we really read Tony K. Bar Assault Eaters, if we really read it, we see that, right? If we're really paying attention to Octavia Butler, who is ever so popular at the moment, then we see ourselves in that work. And so I'm thinking about, oh, how do I make sure when I am in my political homes and communities that are really into police and prison abolition, and say, hey, so if most climate crises, about 93 to 96% of climate crises are water related, what does that mean for Flint and Chicago and Durham and Mississippi, right? Like, what does that mean? Oh, and you know who needs water? People who are incarcerated also. So what does it mean when we say Flint doesn't have clean water? Who else? Who are the most vulnerable, right? And we are quick to say women and children, and that is absolutely true, right? Single mothers, particularly, right? Especially if I think about the city of Flint and what those demographics are. Children, immigrants, undocumented immigrants, right? And those of us who are incarcerated, and that kind of gets lost in this conversation when we talk about water, I've noticed specifically. And so thinking about, right, where I'm sitting now as a cultural memory worker who is using primarily the mediums of television, film, and theater, this is the place that I am currently doing battle when I am not engaged in, you know, grassroots organizing. And so I see theater, right, as this medium that has the opportunity to really be ripe for thinking about our mutual aid campaigns and how necessary they are, and government failure being the reason why we consistently have to have mutual aid campaigns, like being the place that can show us ourselves in the world that we're currently in, while also showing us a world that we can live in, right? Because we get to make it up. Theater is literal make-believe, right? So we're either reflecting or we're creating. And we have the privilege to be able to do that. And then how do we do that in a way that is not undoing the work of EJ movement people? Meaning, how can you make your set sustainable? How can we spend less money on production and actually interface with communities, right? So when I think about, you know, the work that I'm doing around water specifically, and I know we'll get deeper into it, you know, I am always pushing the boundaries. How do we partner with Julie's Bicycle, who helps theaters create more sustainable sets? Okay, how do we reuse the water? How do we make sure our costumes are, you know, not undoing work that has been done elsewhere, while trying to amplify the message, right? I also think that theater is a place, because people gather in mass, it's an opportunity for building critical connections, but also for igniting capacity building efforts, and for igniting movement. I think artists are the vanguard of the revolution. Many of us are either politicized and then radicalized by our own experiences of some form of injustice, or by a piece of art that we've seen that is highlighting some form of injustice, right? And so how do we not only highlight it, how do we move past the consciousness development into further political education? How do we use the medium as a tool to radicalize people to organize together, not these just individual, solitary, one-time actions to which we are then not accountable to people, right? And this makes social media, you know, like difficult to navigate, because it is a great tool, but also it's like, oh, but like offline, no, because the Underground Railroad was what? Underground for a reason, right? You know, so how do we, right, use this medium to raise consciousness, to incite political involvement, but also to highlight the needs that we currently have, and perhaps form a way to meet them right on stage. I think about community land trusts because I am from Chicago and New Orleans, and so those are the places that I center in my work and in my heart, though I am currently based in New York. And so I'm also very conscious of what it means to be right next to Jersey right next to Newark who had their own water crises, and cities next to Newark who have not even been named in this issue of water, right? And so I'm thinking about community land trusts in cities like Chicago and New Orleans specifically that are struggling with displacement. And we always, I think, point to gentrification first, but there are other ways to displace Black people, right? And so we're conscious of that. I'm thinking about community-centered water initiatives, primarily in New Orleans, when we think about climate crisis and how can we, and what is the access point? New Orleans is the future in many ways. So we talk about, having multiple crises at this moment, but New Orleans taught us what would happen, because this happened already, right? That we've done this apocalypse of racism and climate crisis and government failure and death tolls that are still incomplete, right? Because we're very specific about what counts as a COVID death, like we were very specific about what counts as a Katrina death and what doesn't count, and the illnesses that we incur because of complex PTSD and things that we don't consider a part of the original apocalypse. But Katrina showed us the future already. New Orleans showed us the future. And what have we learned? How are we listening? How is that really the place where we do a lot of our political education and say, oh, let's look at the resilience of these people. Oh, how have these communities, how has Treme survived, even through its changing right now and the displacement that is occurring? What does it take for the state of Louisiana, the city of New Orleans, to really get on board with a transformative water plan, right? Like one that doesn't just care about the cute uptown near Tapatulas where all the white people are now living, Garden District.
The quote unquote arts district. Yes.
Exactly, right? And so I'm thinking about, community land trusts, community-centered water initiatives, radical placemaking, and the connectivity of the arts being a way to radicalize people around what's going on and to make invisible systems visible, like water, because how many of us really knew much about water systems and lead and all of that before reading it or encountering it in some way that felt accessible to us? And so I am here in that vein of the work.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that what my grandmother said a long time is what's old is new again. The communities up and down the Hudson have been fighting these fights, riparian rights, and whether or not you can own property next to water, if water is life, has been a thing we've been discussing since the now, right? So some of this is about whether or not we're passing this information on. I also want to lift up that you talked about the apocalypse. That's a Greek word, which means unsheathing, revealing, uncovering.
Revealing,
right?
yes.
So if what we're talking about is the apocalypse, the revealing, we're actually concerned about these eyes seeing it, not the fact that this is always happening across the continuum of what we call time. So looking at our different various points, I'm super glad that you started to raise some of the ongoing responses that are happening, the trauma and healing work. I also heard in your comments a little bit of really smart framing of the idea that we have already built these systems. Government exists as a proxy for our work. We already, all of the social systems that currently exist are replicas of community systems that existed previously. Yes. A really fantastic colleague and friend of mine from the Native Organizers Alliance, Judith LeBlanc, we had a long series of conversations last year about climate and indigeneity, and the idea that indigeneity is not about a group. It is about your relationship to land. And all of us are indigenous to land, which means we have relationships. And so that concept of placemaking, the role of the arts doing that, before we had programs, it was the center and the heart of community, and it still is. So really glad that you started to unpack some really incredible questions around that. I'm going to come back to you for some more. I'm going to ask Sakita really quickly, could you begin to paint a picture for us of how the law, which is just another factor in how we do all of this, for better and worse, in evolution and its current derivation, how does that fail to address, or how could it address issues of environment and climate injustice? Because Erica has so nicely tied it together that these things are not happening abstractly. You cannot have the site of a resistance if there's not another form of tension. The law is often served to do that, but we built the law. We designed the law. We are a part of, like, we are the thing that drives it with our money, with our bodies, whether we're a currency or whether we are actually the mechanisms making it happen. So Sakita, could you talk to us a little bit about the duality of the role of the law in doing this work?
Definitely. I wanted to give an extra shout out to Erica. You brought forward something I've been navigating around, and I learned of this concept of the fantastic pragmatic, and to be both in the space of understanding the very real realities that we are navigating day to day, the trauma and the healing work, and connecting that with the fantastic, which is, I think the roots of that meaning only existing in imagination. So for those of us who are coming from a perspective that the current reality is unacceptable, right? How do we connect our work that we're doing now with the imagination? And that it could take from and borrow from, I think, our ancestral knowledge of what freedom is. But it's for me, that role of folks who are creative and are in that space of imagining, and really, and as an artist that helped me to see this, Danny Peralta at the Point CDC, which is the audacity of artists and creatives, right? To say, yeah, I get this, and this is the other thing, like here's where else we could be, and those types of things. So just wanted to kind of shout you out. Thank you for bringing that into this space. So the law, a much different conversation.
Yeah. Or okay. Is it?
So yeah,
right,
which is a problem, that it's such a different conversation. I think that the law is problematic in many ways, but I'll point out some of them. First of all, it's very rigid. It's primarily set up to protect the status quo. Okay, from law enforcement to judges to Congress, it's meant to protect the status quo, as opposed to being open to, say, revolution, let alone even incremental change. It is very reactive. Most of the law is very, very reactive, and limited by what is seen limited by whatever kind of cultural dominance is that has accessibility to policy and politics. So that is those who are influencing in those ways. I want to bring forward, again, Erica, you talked about the intersectionality with the prison system or criminal justice system, as an aspect of law, as an aspect of how we enforce law, and all of the racial and social injustices embedded in that system. And you brought forward access to clean water. There's certainly a heightened sighting and exposure of folks in the prison system to pollution. I'm thinking of the valley fever epidemic that was happening in California. And also the irony that, coming from California, our prisoners are also on the front lines of fighting wildfires. Yeah. So it's another intersectionality with climate change, that now we have these issues and we are preying on our most vulnerable members of society or what we have created. We've created society so these folks are vulnerable, to now say you have to step up and be in these extremely dangerous circumstances to help us address a problem that you did not create.
Not only did you not create it, you weren't advised about it. You were told it's too complicated for you to get involved in, that the words are too big, the credentials are too wide, and you don't have a place in it. So, so yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think for the law to be able to improve, it has to be power to the people in a real way. So if we are not, it has to be accountable to people. It has to, and in that transition, we have to start breaking down law so that the law actually includes language, making it mandatory to center the needs, interests, and realities of communities that have been historically kept out of the legal infrastructure, as you were just pointing to, Tamara, right? Like we've set this system up to be very exclusive. And as a result, we have disenfranchised, marginalized communities that are dealing with the externalities of our economic and social systems, right? And so we have to change language in law to make it mandatory to center the needs, visions of those communities, bringing resources, public resources to those communities to support the place-based evolution of whatever vision those communities have for their healing, for their future, for their education systems, for their healthy air, all of that. And so, and it also, another area of improvement for law, which is we kind of started the first question around accessibility to it. So law is intentionally inaccessible. We can change legal language to make it more accessible, so that folks, the decision makers, whether it's advisory committees that bring at least a voice of communities that are impacted by the policies at play, to be able to actually do some form of participatory policy making, right? That's ideal, that communities are actually able to be driving the conversation of our political systems and our policies, and embedding accountability. We can do this in law. We intentionally don't. It's that's the type of long language that you see corporations and other special interests get really anxious about, right? Because ultimately that's where you shift power, right? Is having those points of accessibility and accountability to community. And just giving a shout out to, it was mentioned, Katrina mentioned before, the first National People of Color Environmental Justice Summit in 1991, and we're celebrating the anniversary of a beautiful kind of historic recognition of the power of activists and community-centered leaders coming together and influencing policy, right? We see folks taking to the streets, we see conversations changing, and need to continue. But the impact of us being organized on and radicalized, as Erica is bringing forward for us, to have that power to influence the way that policy and law is shaped.
Thank you, Sakita. I'd say that what I'm hearing from you is that we have to figure out where we are in the arc of reform, revolution, or abolition, right? And the idea that the law works against us is about the design of the law. Like the design of the law, it means that there are no freak accidents. There are only results of the system at working as design. And we just have to ask, is this our design? Is it working for us? And since the answer is clearly no, what are we going to do to move into that arc in a way that shifts it so it works for our bodies, our lives, our communities? Karina, could you talk to us a little bit about some of the alignments, or the missed opportunities and the challenges that you see in the work that you do? Because wildlife biology can often be seen as something that fits into a race neutral narrative, which it took a little while for people to figure out how harmful that was. So can you talk about what folks are being forced to reckon with and the harm that it's caused right at this moment, where we're right at the beginning of the climate decade? And if we don't get it right today, it will not be right then.
Right. So, as has been echoed multiple times in multiple ways by both Erica, yourself, Tamara, Sakita, like the siloing of wildlife biology and wildlife management and natural resources management has created this illusion of race neutral, decision making, race neutral impacts, right? So we know this unequivocally. One of the greatest frustrations that I have, number one, is that, Sakita, when you were talking about like kind of the exclusivity of lawmaking and policy, I see that same kind of pattern reflected in the world of natural resource management and wildlife management and biology and science, even more largely, is this fetish. It's almost like a fetish for exclusivity. There's this, it almost seems like that's the central value, it seems, of maintaining power in these spaces and excluding the voices of the people who, again, are experiencing the most immediate and strongest impacts of every decision that's made about wildlife, about natural resources. And coming into a space that was designed to keep me out on many axes of my identity, right? The fact that I come from a low-income background means that I can't afford to work for 4 years for free to end up getting into wildlife biology, which is required for most careers in this field, right? The fact that when I come into this conservation organization, I'm seeing pictures on the wall of your, when you're talking about the protection of large carnivores, right? Or you're talking about the protection of tropical rainforests, you're showing me images of indigenous people cutting down rainforests to plant palm plantations, but I don't see a single white person downing a Wendy's cheeseburger or demanding these certain hair products that are literally creating the demand for palm oil, right? We are the reason we are like this society that we are operating in, this zoo, this conservation organization is participating in what's creating that. Like, the indigenous people that you are painting as the villain are the victims of the system that you have created. And it's just like the whole thing, from the way that we communicate the problem to the way that we understand the problem to the way, and when I say we, let me clarify, I don't mean us. I mean the people who have created and lead the system in which we operate. I don't want to, a lot of times when we think in these spaces, when the people in leadership think about, oh, equity, oh, diversity, right? It's like, let's bring in the people who aren't here into the system that we've created. And it's like, no, that's actually not the end goal. And tomorrow, when you were talking about like, your radical, what you want to see happen in conservation, a complete restructuring, a complete, recentering of values. It's like, the goal is not to bring in the people who have been victimized by the system into the system to now somehow participate in this, you know what I mean? This you all have been doing, but rather the values are all wrong. The values follow the culture that has been perpetuated by white supremacy, again, by colonialism, and that the whole structure, the root has to change. And so I think that we're not even there yet when it comes to conservation, wildlife conservation and natural resources management. I think people love to use the word equity. People love to use, this kind of language with no concept of how radical that actually is. And so,
yes, I have been known to say that MLK didn't get murdered over diversity.
Hello.
I just want to flag for people that it was the equity thing that people weren't comfortable with.
And diversity is not equity.
Correct.
Any circumstance. You know what I'm saying?
Go ahead.
And so it's what I'm thinking essentially about how we move forward, what we're doing in this space to actually address the issues that we're facing. I think we're, as you said, and as the question implied, like we are forced to now realize, like the people who have essentially been insulated from needing to think about intersectionality are seeing just how critical it is, just how present it has been the whole time. And one of what I try to do in my space is to call these organizations that, have been very much siloed in their thinking about, well, we are a bird organization, right? So I work for Georgia Audubon, which is a wildlife conservation organization that focuses on birds. So our niche feels very specific. And a lot of times organizations in these circumstances, particularly in conservation, have operated that way, have operated with blinders on that simply kind of results in their efforts, their resources being placed into a very narrow stream of efforts. But because of this intersectionality, and because they messed up and hired me, because they messed up and let me into the space, and other people, not people like me, people who I'm like, people who have been leaders in this space for a long time, they're learning that these resources can't stay here. The values that you have cannot be, we can't continue to center your values here, because we will continue the exploitation that has been happening for a long time. And I just want to uplift the work of Dr. J. Drew Lanham, who is a Black ornithologist and an artist, mad intersectional leader, along with Dr. Carolyn Finney. And both of these people, and Erica, I was so really hooked on what you were saying, talking about art, because I saw this quote somewhere and I don't remember who said it, but essentially the fact that art allows us to imagine what we stand to lose, right, if we do not get this right. And it also allows us to imagine what we stand to gain if we do, like what we stand to gain if we disrupt the value system that we've been subjected to for so long. And even myself, right, I'm not an artist. So this was kind of a new frontier for me. So as a biologist and as a person who comes from a background that has been subjected to violence in many ways, when I first got connected to these Black artists who were in the space that I was in, like the kind of hope that was renewed in me, right? The kind of vision that was renewed in me was like indescribable. Like I am just now realizing how powerful art is in understanding these intersections, right? Because it can be hard to describe to some people, to some, you know, demographics, people with power and money, white folks, white communities, right? Like why these intersections matter, how they play out, what they actually look like. And art is that perfect like nexus. It brings it together in such a powerful way that I'm still just at the beginning of understanding. So that was a lot. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I have so many thoughts going through my mind. But like Erica, like the things that you said, and Sakita as well. Like it's just there are so many degrees, manifestations, right, of these intersections and arts and storytelling. Oh, the other thing I want to say was, the other problem, right, is that I didn't even know that I had a place in the story besides terror, right? All that I knew about when it came to Black people in the outdoors was strange fruit. That's all I knew. I didn't know anything about relationship. I didn't know anything about our investment and our interaction and our right relationship with the land that we were, you know, imported to, right? As well as the land that we're actually from. Like, and when I realized the story that I was actually a part of, that was really the point at which I was like, oh, this whole system, this whole value system, it ain't right. You know what I'm saying? And I think that one of the biggest gaps for me when I'm like, you know, I'm employed by these conservation organizations and it's my job to go out to my community, right? I'm not from Atlanta. I know, you know, I'm new here. And not all Black communities have the same needs, have the same focuses when it comes to, you know, what are the issues affecting this geographical place. And when I'm coming to them, the story that I'm sharing with them is not their story. You know what I mean? The values that I'm sharing with them are not their values. And it took a learning experience for me to unlearn a lot of what I had been taught by this colonialism-based conservation ethic, essentially, right? And I'm relearning still, and it's been through literally Black women scholars who are uplifting and highlighting and publicizing the stories that are not told, that are intentionally buried, that are never, ever taught in any space in conservation. I have never heard this come up in conservation. And so Black women have entered academia, have entered the arts, have entered, you know what I mean, who have become uplifted. And we've been here, right? It's not like we're new to the arts or we're new to conservation or we're new to stewardship. We're not new, but our voices have not been placed in the mainstream of the system that people pay attention to. And I've suffered from that. I've you know, that has impacted my worldview. And I'm just now learning about these incredible Black women, these incredible Black people who are telling this true story, capital T, truth, right? Like you said, Sakita, who are telling the truth and allow me and other folks like me who are in this space and related spaces to actually imagine what's possible, to actually have an accurate understanding of the ways in which they fit in their history in this realm. Man, I'm on fire right now. Y'all got me.
That was beautiful.
Yeah,
that was like, you captured it.
You are weaving the thread that makes this conversation stronger. And I feel like what you just touched on around your own awakening, the constant apocalypse that has happened, the unsheathing of more information, as you start to realize you are not missing from this history, your view of your history is what's missing. And I do think like we have to unwrap this in so many conversations that we cannot have at this moment. But I do think like even the ideas around how we arrive at wokeness, right? The conversation around wokeness and what that means, it makes some assumptions about like we invented writing, we invented paper. So like what are the ways that we tell stories? Are many, are plenty, are all of them? People have borrowed these tools from our community. We have opened up that space because as people, we are always gate openers. We are always bridge builders. There is no version of us in history where that has not been the case. The question is who has access to that history, who has access to those stories. Can we talk a little bit more? I like where you were going with this, Karina, about our individual stories, Sakita and Erica, and then we'll roll back to you, Karina, to talk a little bit about your site of resistance, the place where you are bringing accessibility and intersectionality and community to the work that you're doing and why that's revolutionary. Because I do think it's easy for us to talk about it in the we. It's hard to talk about it in the I because that work is dotted with trauma. And it's not a future forward trauma or back, it's like present day trauma. So can you talk about what it means to I call it, I have told people who have worked for me that if I'm breaking through the glass ceiling, I don't have the energy to move in the other direction to pick up the glass, which isn't about not wanting to have these things, but recognizing that the energy of your life force is going into this. Sakita, Erica, Karina, can you talk to us a little bit about what that is like for people who don't show up in your jobs, in your body, doing what you do every day? And then we'll open it up to questions after that.
I will start really quick. I'm excited to hear everyone's responses on this. I will start by saying something that has, like, I've been thinking about ever since we had our first planning call, which is, my vision is that Erica is creating beautiful art. She's in theater, and she's not having to organize around, in her community, around the traumas of police brutality, inaccessibility to water. Like, I want Karina to study the hell out of some birds. Just study the birds. I want you, Tamara, to be in West Africa cold chilling. That's like, but that's real. Like, sometimes I reflect on the fact that, yes, we're in here doing the work, and we're doing it well, and we are doing all of our, whatever our self-care regimes are to keep it together.
Self-defense.
And to keep, sorry?
Self-defense, self-care is a form of self-defense.
We are doing all of these things 24 hours a day. And it's really, the vision is that we don't have to carry this, right? And that's not the case. It's where we are. But I think, to your question, Tamara, and I think let me know if I'm answering it correctly, is to really be, I think, showing up for the people that I am most connected to Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, to have those relationships strong, to, I get a lot of soul energy from the natural environment. And so being in right relationship with nature, having those spiritual connections with nature, are ways that keep me, I think, grounded and able to mobilize in this space, right? Just being on this panel is part of that. And so I think that, for folks who maybe aren't, working in the same ways that we work, I think that, we don't have the privilege to just like launch a organization that is only focused on the preservation of birds. We don't have like, I don't have the ability to just think about carbon, and greenhouse gas emissions, right? Like, we have to carry this intersectionality, because we are the intersectionality, as you had pointed out earlier, right? We have to be in that. So, I don't know what my message is, except that, we are in it, we are working through it, we're doing it with beauty and grace. And we're doing it for our answers.
You say I want to hear, because I want to hear Sakita, I want to hear how Sakita is holding this, because we are counting on you, but you got to be you and the four of us do that.
Yes, exactly. And I am doing it authentically for my ancestors and future generations as well. It's really important that I show up in this way, across the continuum.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
Oh man, this is just so great. I'm just sitting here like fed spiritually, politically, just all of it. So I use transdisciplinary theater and performative installation as cultural work technologies to radicalize people in the service of Black liberation. Because when Black women are free, so the Combine Heat River Collective taught me, right, then everyone gets free. Totally here for transnational coalition building, comrades from all over. So when I think abolition, and when I'm thinking water issues and the injustices that are happening in so many cities and rural areas in this country, I am also linking that to Palestine, where I was in 2019, in Israel, and thinking about how Israel is controlling Palestine's access to clean water and how much of it they get. I'm also thinking about the police state in Turkey, right? And so how do I then create work for Black people. To be very clear, I organize Black people, I write for Black audiences, while knowing that other people will bear witness to the work. But I'm so much more interested in intra-community conversations with my own people, gathering my own people,
Yes.
strengthening my own people, than I am negotiating with white people and teaching white people. So I don't actually use any of my energy towards that. Bless those of you who do. That is important work. It is not my work. So thematically, I am obsessed with land legacies, Black apocalyptic ritual, environmental racism. And so the body of work that I'm currently creating, this template Katrina cycle, as well as other work like Colored Water, which was interrupted by the pandemic when it was about to be mounted at the public, and it's going to come back around. But that particular play has the Flint water crisis as its socio-political backdrop and talks about these 3 generations of Black women and girls who are surviving that crisis, and what it means for an ecological crisis to then bring up, stir up, allow other things that are apocalyptic in Black women's lives to rise to the surface, right? And so all of this body of work centers climate-induced and state-sanctioned water vulnerabilities and displacement rippling in and beyond New Orleans, but also Chicago, Midwest, Flint, Detroit, right? I'm thinking about the legacy of these factory towns and these kind of automobile, since the center of that post-Great Migration in the Midwest, which is often forgot of. Now, living on the on the East Coast, and people don't know like what Black Midwest is, and I'm like, oh, okay, we got some learning curves to address, right? Yes. In our history, our access to histories beyond the coast. And so in these works, I'm particularly tackling the politics of disgust, shame, and refusal by highlighting this like rupture of government intervention at the intersection of capitalism and environmental racism and its impact on dispossessed Black people, namely women and girls. And when I say Black, I am thinking diaspora, right? When I think New Orleans Black, I'm thinking multiple Black communities. And so in that way, I think I am striving to do what Toni Cade Bambara and Robin B.G. Kelly tells us, describes poets, describes playwrights. So, right, PCB calls poets community health workers. And so to me, right, in this COVID era and beyond, that also means that poets are essential workers. She says that it's their job to call us to something higher than a fish sandwich and a job. And there is nothing wrong with a good fish sandwich and a job, right? But we are not just here for that, right? And so then I think about how Robin D.G. Kelly in Freedom Dreams starts the book by saying, when movements have been unable to clear the clouds, it has been the poets, no matter the medium, who have succeeded in imagining the color of the sky and rendering the kind of dreams and futures social movements are capable of producing, right? That the most radical art is not protest art, but it's work that actually takes us to another place, work that envisions a different way of seeing or perhaps a different way of feeling. And so I think I'm tackling this, how do we see? By Minister Candace Simpson, and I went to seminary, so a lot of how I think about this work and any work is in a spiritual way. And Candace recently, Candace recently preached this beautiful sermon where she was talking about Octavia Butler's work and prophets. And prophets are my personal favorite part of the Bible to preach because I just think it's so juicy and apocalyptic, and they
also there's so much scandal. There's so much scandal. Like read the thing, man. This you watching TV. There's a book full of stuff that you ain't never thought about doing. Just flagging it.
Hello, and that is in every sacred text, to be real, right? Like so Candace is preaching Amos and talking about Octavia Butler's work, and I promise that this is not a diversion. But she says, prophets are not people who just know the future. Octavia Butler was not a prophet because she just knew the future or could see it. It's because she pays attention. Prophets are people who pay attention. Prophets are people who read, right? And so she's not just talking about reading books like literature. She's talking about the way our grandmothers read the weather through their bodies and say, I know it's about to rain, right? And so I think about that, and she calls us to ask, who are the people in our neighborhood? Who are the prophets in our field? And is it you? Is it you, right? And what does that mean for what your job is, right? Like people often misquote Toni Cade-O'Mara, and it is like my biggest pet peeve. There's because she was asked by Kay Bonetti in the 80s in this interview, like, oh, what do you think the role of an artist is? And her answer is that it is the role of the cultural worker to make revolution irresistible. And that really the answer depends on where you are in your work, right? So if you are a part of the establishment, then your job is to maintain the status quo. If you are a part of the revolution, then your job is to upend that shit, right? And to incite, to make certain calls, put certain calls out there. And so I see it as my job as a person who is Black, queer, disabled, like all of the things in many ways, right? To serve the people who name me, the communities who name me, but also to continue in the Black radical tradition artistically. So I don't make art for art's sake. What is that? I don't even understand the concept, like never had the privilege, right? But how can it be in service to our liberation and then to everyone's liberation by being specific about who I'm writing about and where, right, geographically my work is placed? That then allows for the kind of universality that white people love to talk about, right? And how like, oh, this relates to everyone. When we're really specific, when we're really doing our work, when we're really sweeping around our own front door and taking care of home, then I think we become, better comrades transnationally and across even, north, south, rural, city-fied. So that's what I'm endeavoring to do. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'll kick it over to you, Karina, before we go to questions, and just remind everybody that we built the city out of the country. So I just want to flag for people that when we talk about these things that we did as though they're the only things that are, we fail every time, because the basics are that this stuff is stuff we did. so these like decisions about whether or not these people can be spoken to about these things suggests like things we are holding up as we talk about them and giving them more power every time. Karina, can you talk to us a little bit about, the I in some of this, and where you are struggling with these tensions, what you are building and tearing down every time you open your mouth or show up in the room or in the Zoom where it's happening?
There's so much here. And like hearing Erica and Zakita and all of you, so what I think about the last thing you said, Erica, when you said taking care of home, and what Zakita was saying, what are the battles happening? And Erica, you also mentioned this, what are the battles happening where you are? And I think what I am called to do and what I strive to do in every way, whether I'm talking about like the hard sciences of, wildlife biology and morphology of birds, whatever it might be, right? I try to make sure that the resources at the disposal of the organization that I'm a part of, which at this time is Georgia Audubon in Atlanta, right, is being funneled in every way that I can possibly make it happen, is being funneled to the front lines of environmental issues. And right here in Atlanta, right, in the Southeast United States, Southeast, of this colonized place, is really a hotbed for a lot of environmental racism. Happens all over, right? Definitely rampant all over this country. In Atlanta, for example, one of the biggest kind of edges of environmental racism and displacement is this green gentrification that I had mentioned earlier, right? Where it's, people on the west side of Atlanta specifically, there are communities that are literally actively being pushed out to make this wildlife haven, to make this place to come and view wildlife and be, bask in the outdoors and in nature, right? Which follows the model of like our national parks, which follows the model of consumption of nature and using it as a tool for relaxation, right? As opposed to being part of it. And because of this value system, people are being pushed out without a second thought. And so part of my work as a biologist at Georgia Audubon is to lift the consciousness of the people who are holding the power, right? This is an organization that has historically served white dominated, in fact, like probably a mostly, if not all, white constituency. And to be honest, if I have to be honest with y'all, that is a tension.
Please be honest.
Right? It's like, I'm here to redistribute the stuff y'all got. But the fact that I even represent this organization, like every day,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? When I'm doing this work, it's something that I'm just like, something about it feels almost like a sacrifice, that I'm sacrificing a part of the revolution by being associated. And I might have coworkers watching this, and if you're hearing this, you need to hear it. Like,
it's okay. There are a lot of jobs in the world, but there's only one calling. And guess what? The people who hired you, they knew who you were when they hired you.
Yes.
It was actually a key ingredient, I'm certain, while not being in the room, that it was on the face of the thing. Go for it.
Listen, I thank you for saying that. And so what I do is I say, okay, Westside, the communities around Westside Park just wrote a long letter to Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms here in Atlanta saying, listen, we have been at this for 15 years trying to get you to set up a plan to prevent the displacement of my neighborhood, of our neighborhoods in the creation of this park, right? Y'all have not followed through on your promises. You have not done X, Y, Z. And so I said, listen, whatever resources Georgia Audubon has, whether we're talking about the platform, whether we're talking about money, like actual dollars, the fact that we have a Zoom account that can hold 500 people, whatever it might be,
right?
We're going to offer these resources to these efforts to people who have literally been victimized over and over and over again, and continue to be this day by the systems that this organization has participated in upholding. And so organizing alongside communities, the geographical, that are specific to a geographical place like Westside community, and saying, hey, listen, these are the resources that I have access to as a member of this organization or as an employee of this organization. How can they best serve the Westside Atlanta neighborhoods? How do you envision the expertise that I have as a biologist and my ability to identify birds in the natural world? How can I put this to best use, in your opinion, for these communities, right? And so I create programs and structures that are rooted in this, right? And Tamara, you had mentioned, correct me if I get this wrong, like the combination of, did you say metrics and magic, something like that?
Yes, people act like you have to choose one or the other, and it's whoever's telling you that is telling you something. Watch what they say next. Yes.
Yes. And so combining now, you put it perfectly, right? So I'm like, okay, y'all like to speak in metrics and like systems of of measuring that y'all created. So let's look at a map, right? When it comes to birds in particular, I'm gonna get a little specific here, and forgive me if it's a little left field, but like when it comes to birds in particular and bird conservation, protecting birds, understanding how birds are impacted by climate change, that group of birds as a group of organisms are some of the most popular among people. And so there are lots of community science platforms that rely on everyday people who aren't scientists just inputting the birds they see, and they're free applications, inputting the birds they see, and they get funneled into a database about birds, and it helps us make really important conservation decisions. When you look at a map of Atlanta, if you overlay median income and you overlay the data points submitted by people who are looking at birds, there is literally an extremely tight relationship between income level and people who are participating in community science. And it's like, I knew this was the case. I have no, I grew up in these kinds of spaces. Like, we knew this, but because, y'all struggle to see it, I'm going to show you the data. I'm going to show you the way this actually spatially works out using y'all's tools, right, that y'all love to lean on. And then combining that with the magic, like the activation that's already happening in the communities and plugging into the leadership structures, right? Again, I'm not from this space, so I'm not going to repeat the kind of savior, mentality or method of engagement where it's like, I want to come in with the answers. No, I'm not from here. You all know your space. You all are already leading in this space. How can I put the resources that I have to best use for your community? And so that's kind of the work that I have done and aim to do as best I can, and to surround myself with incredibly smart Black women, like the women on this call, to help me learn about the ways in which my mind has been shaped by white supremacy. The way that I see the world has been shaped by white supremacy, and undoing that and relearning, because there is a great relearning that myself, along with a lot of people, have to do because of the kinds of environments that we've been subject to, especially in academia and especially in these, learning institutions that have been dominated by colonialism and by white supremacy. And so learning, teaching myself, and making myself available, and the resources that I have access to because I'm in these spaces, making them available to the people who have been victimized by the systems that they live in, is the work that I aim to accomplish.
We love the redistribution of funds.
Yes. I was gonna
all
say
about
that.
it.
I think this has been just an incredible opening of a conversation. Albert Krasinski said the map is not the territory. And I think that that's the through line across all of this, is that like what we see is about how it's presented, what the information is underneath that is about whose lens you're looking at it, whether you are looking at it through the law, you're looking at it through the arts, whether you're looking at it through science and technology, you are translating across lots of different spaces what your viewpoint is. And if we don't own that, we can send people in the wrong direction, and they can think that the map is all there is, and it isn't. On that note, I'm going to pivot into our Q&A because some folks have been at the brim here. They're trying to ask some questions, so I'll stop being selfish and open up to the community and say, Tanya Pham has asked, as women in leadership roles, how important has mentorship been for you on your journey? How do you make time to support and mentor other people, especially women of color who want to move into leadership roles? And whoever wants to answer that first.
I'm so about that decentralized leadership. So I will say that it is hard for me I recognize power dynamics, right? Inherent in like job position titles and things like that. So I do not ignore those power dynamics. And also, right, everyone is a leader in some domain that they have influence over, right? So I stay with mentors and stay mentoring. That doesn't always look like a formal, you are my mentee and like we're gonna sit and have coffee. It may mean, I'm teaching a person a strategy for direct action in this moment, or I'm talking to a younger playwright, younger meaning where they are in their career, not age, right? About how to navigate the inherent heterosexism in a white theater institution and the racism there, or in a Black institution, the heterosexism, because that's also part of like this thing where it's like, I heard you, Karina, where you were talking about the tension of working in these predominantly white spaces, white created spaces. And it's real when you are trying to do revolutionary work where you're standing, right, but you're in a non-radical space. And so how can you be pushed further left by that experience instead of being made a moderate, right? Like that's real. And I think always, right, redistributing resources and taking all these white people money, which is really what I do at every institution here that I work at. Like, how can I get
one question about that is, whose money is it? Money is another thing we invented, like as a proxy for value. So,
right? And who right now
we
is
needed
the ruling class
this system
who has
needed.
that?
That's
exactly. Right. So when I think about, time to support women, I'm in community all the time. So I think that is something that I don't have to make time for it because I'm in it all the time. Like I prioritize that kind of building. And my mentees are people who are older than me and younger than me. My mentors are people who are older than me and younger than me. And I'm not looking so much for guidance as in tell me what to do, and I'm not here for guidance as in let me tell you what to do, but it's the wisdom about like, okay, where are we and what's needed and what is possible and how can we see further? How can I be a part of your seeing further? How can you be a part of my seeing further? And then we strategize around that in terms of how to, manifest what it is that we are imagining. And so teachers have always been the important mentors in my life, like actual Black women. I've had Black women teachers up until I went to college. Yeah.
Good answer. I'll say that I think I really like the way you reoriented the question, because I do think the models of our life is about constantly being a teacher and being a student and being able to flex in and out of those things where you become a fool. So I do think it's super important for you to lift up that like the age range, the gender range, the idea of a trajectory going in a specific understood concept of what leadership looks like. The person who says the least, who looks the least interested, might be the most powerful person in a given room if you have the vision of what the setup is. So I do think it's important for us to question that. Sakita, Karina, do you want to speak to this idea of sharing information, growing your power, building space for other people in the form of mentoring or leadership?
Karina,
you can go. Yeah.
Okay. I would say that, yes, I totally appreciate and gravitate towards that framing of kind of the continuum of learning, and the kind of the multi-directional relationships with different people in our lives, and how we are able to learn and grow knowledge and get to that truth and wisdom. And yeah, when I have, just specifically in my life, I would say that this younger Sakita, this panel would have been her wildest dreams. My career was mostly very similar to what Karina has explained, in terms of being in an environmental space, and almost always being the only Black person of color, woman of color for sure, right? And so that has reinforced in me the importance of me being, if folks want to talk to me being accessible and available to whoever, especially younger folks. And I love that classification, both younger as in new to the field, or are actually younger in age, and carrying with me in those relationships like a curiosity. So I center that curiosity and learning, and as a result, I might learn more from them than they learn from me. And I joke and I tell folks that, but certainly having that, just being in a shared space of commitment to certain issues, and through learning and kind of that connectivity that you get just from being in relationship with folks in different ways. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Karina, any thoughts?
Yeah, mentorship is the only reason why I ended up in wildlife science in the first place. And I had grown up loving, like I said, like I had a real affinity for the outdoors and wildlife, even though I didn't have any kind of like personal interaction. But when I was about to go to college and I didn't really know what to do, I was like, veterinary medicine, that's all I know about. I met a Black woman zookeeper at the Philadelphia Zoo, at my local zoo. And not just a Black woman zookeeper, but one who constantly like questioned and shook the system up constantly. And she reached out to me. We had like a mutual friend or a colleague, and she reached out to me and immediately took me past all the red tape. She made all the calls. She said, listen, I know she's a minor, but she's going to come back with me to the large carnivores. Okay. So she took me back. She sat me down. She shared with me everything she knew. She shared her resources as far as like contacts for experts in different wildlife fields. She shared with me not just what she knew and what she learned, but the things and resources she had access to, and modeled for me what it looks like to not settle for the status quo in your institution, or in an institution of which you are a part. And so without seeing her and then being exposed to what she knew and what she did, I would not be here. I literally, like when I was 17 years old, I never even considered being a wildlife biologist, not because I didn't like wildlife, I loved wildlife, but every single one that I ever saw was a white male. And it wasn't even a conscious, it was never a conscious thought that I was like, oh, I can't be that because I'm a Black woman. My mind had just been structured to understand the world that way. And it wasn't until I saw her that I remember the moment where I literally was like, oh, I never even thought of this. And I'm like, is representation and access that powerful? Yes, it is. And so because I have experienced how powerful that kind of mentorship is, I've tried to recreate that scenario, that kind of relationship, which I still have with her 10 years later, for others. And as Erica said, like constantly being mentored, and then offering. And mentorship, by the way that I think about it, is really just making any resources that I have, whether they be learning experiences or finances or access, connections, whatever it is, making those available to as many people as I can, and being accessible, as Sakita had mentioned. So that's kind of what mentorship has done for me, as well as kind of what I hope it can do for others moving forward.
And I just want to lift up that there's some fire going on in the chat, as well as Erica added a point that not all mentors are human beings. Nature itself is a mentor. If you sit down long enough, you'll learn something. So I do think it's important to recognize that to the person that is open, you can learn from everything. My grandfather would say, a broken watch is right twice a day. So
hello.
There are, even in all the imbalances that currently exist, there's so much wisdom in the natural world and in the relationships that we hold. And being human means we gotta look past a lot of things to get to the wisdom. There's another question here, and a compliment to each of you about just how incredible how much this resonance has been very eloquent and an elegant example of why we should be doing this more often. The person wants to know, what are each of you doing as your own self-defense or self-care? Because it is harder to do this work when it is also your calling in a way that separates. If you're just doing a job where you punch in and punch out, you have a very clear idea of what you're doing from day to day. But if your work is care work or repair work in any way, you're doing it 24 hours a day. So what are you doing when you're not on fire?
I'm taking very decadent baths. Like I'm talking real like medicine woman shit, like real all the herbs and the teas and the petals. And yes, I'm doing that. That is a 3 to 4 time a week practice. And like, it may seem small, like, oh, that's one of the cute self-care things. No, but spiritual baths and cleansing and being still. This is actually why I wrote Water as a Master Teacher, because forcing myself to sit in a tub for 90 minutes, at least 90 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week, teaches me stillness and gives me a place to really be committed, right, and disciplined about my time to reflect and to be by myself. Because I'm a cultural memory worker, it means I am always engaging the past, right? And we know that not all parts of the past are, well, we could have a conversation about the usable past and things that we want to carry forward and things that we don't, but it is, I'm a Jane Easy. So there is that, and engaging the past consistently means that I am engaging a lot of the suffering that I am trying to avenge for my ancestors, while also incurring my own suffering, right? Writing about apocalypse while in apocalypse. And so I do think that for me, I've had to take critical distance. I've had to be mindful as a person with an invisible disability and several autoimmune diseases. I've had to step back from direct action grassroots organizing, right? So I wasn't in the streets this past summer, and it hurt me because I'm like, that's what I know. That was my first thing. And it's like, okay, but yes, and last time you lost eyesight. And so what does that mean for what is best for you in this realm and how you can be most useful? Oh, this means that I'm giving all the coin and that I'm being a bell runner. Okay, this means, right, being very flexible in how I wield my energy, resources, and skills. And so that has allowed me to be more efficient and effective in my work, so that I am not always starting from scratch in my self-care, that I am actually in flow. And so that, and having friends, Black women, best friends, who call me on my stuff and say, you need to be resting, or you need to step back from your process because the work that you're making in some ways is triggering you. And therapy and somatic work are literally gifts to folks. Can you tell
people very quickly what somatic work is? Because that is very quickly becoming one of those coded terms that you either in the club or you standing outside hoping to bounce.
Yeah, so the way that I would just like very plainly say, it's working on how to make embodied decisions, so that I'm not simply reacting. I'm very much in tune with the way that my complex trauma resides in my body, what my trauma responses are, and making decisions from a different place. It's such like somatic work is such like abolition work in some ways, because it's about seeing the full plate of options that you have, besides like, this person did something I don't like, so I'm going to cuss them out, which can be an embodied decision if you choose it, right? Because sometimes you have to choose the cuss out, but seeing the full platter of options of your responses from a very rooted and centered place is how I would describe a somatic practice. And because we are so often, especially those of us who come out of grassroots organizing circles, so often, doing rapid response, that we don't realize we live that. And it's like, no, how do I sit? How do I be still? How do I feel it out? And what am I feeling? And so when I'm responding, I know the place that I'm responding from, and I'm able to communicate where I am and also stretch possibility for how I can be in relationship with other people.
Thank you so much. And yes, somatic is the term Najiri. Okay, Karina or Sakita, do you want to talk about when you go into your self-defense kit to pull out some care for yourself? What does that look like? G-rated version only is still daytime somewhere.
You right. That too.
Well, I guess one of the things for me is that an interesting kind of combination of realities that I experience is that what has been very much like a natural form of therapy for me, which is going outside and looking at birds in particular, has also become my job. And so what I found is that I was really lacking in self-care, and I wasn't accessing that the care that comes from that kind of interaction with the outdoors, because it had become so like very rigorously academic, or had become so, so much part of like the everyday work that I'm doing. And so I actually got detached from that for like last year. I like never went birding, which I know sounds maybe, like what is that? Going outside literally and just chasing birds down and looking at them. I didn't do any of that recreationally for myself. And that I felt that literally in my flesh. Like I felt that lack of self-care. And so I am just coming out of a season of like horrible self-care. And I have recently kind of reconnected with the root of why I even am in this field in the first place. And birds are my first love when it comes to wildlife. And so I go outside. Stillness is the key, right? Stillness allows for, very intentional reflection, as Erica was just saying. And it also allows you to detect elements of your surroundings that you would not have noticed if you were moving. And so one of the best ways to even see birds is not just to go outside and walk around, but it's to go outside and stand extremely still and be silent. And it's almost like the birds have always been there, but it's like they start popping out of the forest. And where you thought there were just maybe 2 or 3 birds, turns out there's 50 that have been staring at you the whole time, but you didn't know because you was moving around. Right. And I think birding for me is such an incredible form of self-care. And I try to get everybody. I want y'all to become birders too, if you're not already. I love getting people paying attention to wildlife and birds in particular, because they really embody hope for me. And being someone who's a scientist, so like studying birds, I know the intricacies of their biology and the intricacies of their behavior, the migrations, the physical feats that they're capable of, while at the same time weighing the same amount as like a nickel. Like they're extremely lightweight, and you could break a bird without even trying, but they accomplish some of the most incredible feats on this planet. And that dynamic, and just knowing these things about the birds and watching them, is just such beautiful healing for me. So anyway, that's what I do. That's me.
Thank you for that. And I'll just ask you to please put a note in the birding community social media and just say, please identify yourself. Because if you stand outside a Black woman's house with the binoculars, you better have real good answers about what you're doing there in the city. I recently had to find out from someone that I knew more about birding, because when they were explaining it to me, I was like, oh, you're not a creep, you're a birder. Thank you. That makes me feel a lot better. So I just wanted to ask if you could just whisper it to somebody for everybody's safety until America becomes a safe place for Black people. We just need to lift that up.
That's a whole thing. That's a whole thing in itself.
Sakita, do you want to tell us about what's in your self-care?
Yeah, the 2 things that come to mind are being in liberated spaces with women of color like this, to balance my energy. Erica, you named kind of the like defining those, being in the work of kind of being more proximate to white supremacy and being in the space of creating change within there, and then the spaces where you're with your people that are kind of more clear, heart clear, and connected to the revolutionary radical work. And so being in those spaces helps to balance my energy. So just like this here today. And then definitely nature. It is it's a very important part of my healing and my self-care, and certainly totally get what you're saying, Karina, like the magic of being still in nature, and then that experience of nature coming more alive, or you're able to notice it more, / they feel more, nature feels more comfortable with you. And then the aspect too, which connects, Erica, to your point in the chat, which is a practice of like understanding nature to be a peer and like a holder of wisdom. And so like literally I'll meditate and just kind of sit with a tree and just like, that's my homie. we interact, we kind of connect, we learn from each other, like those types of practices like are so rich for me in terms of healing and balance and kind of, supporting me in my highest vibrations.
Fantastic. This has been an incredible panel. I'm gonna try to squeeze one more question in. We are each people who carry the projections of the whole community. And we are always constantly in the work of being embodied so that what we show up, we are responsible for what we're showing up carrying. Can each of you just reflect really quickly on how you've come to learn that and advice for folks who are trying to do it? Because first only different is a time-bound problem, because you become the first and you become the last. So if anyone wants to answer the question of, if you are carrying all these racialized stereotypes and you represent a community in a space where there just aren't a lot of other ways for people to experience it, how do you own your parts and leave the rest?
All right, I'll say really quickly a couple of things. I probably need to sit with this question more. So just a couple of things.
I know it got, somebody put it in the chat.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
what a tough one.
Channeling my grandmother of like, you show up authentically and with your chest out and your head high. So in any situation, you sit with the pride of who you are and your identity. And the other thing is to not get caught up in, that's other people's issues. Like their perceptions are their issues, and as much as possible to navigate in your authentic way, and not to get caught up. And this is a practice for me because I do it, is to not get caught up in responding to the perception of perceptions or the actual perceptions, because that is they're bringing their own issues to the encounter.
Thank you. Anybody else? Go ahead, Erica.
I really don't care what white people think about me, and so I'm listening to the question trying to be like,
that's also a part of your self-defense care pack.
Because I look at what they've done to the world, and I'm like, well, clearly you're not the authority on
that's right.
on the perspective of much and the value of anything. So, because look at what you did to Indigo. So I don't expect you to get me in the fullness that I am and the legacy and lineage that I come from. Like, of course, it is. We're just outside of your purview, and that's okay. So I think, and I went to a PWI college and seminary.
Can you see what PWI is?
Predominantly white institution.
Oh, okay,
thank you for that. But I went to a very Black, grade school and lived in a Black neighborhood and was raised by Black women. So I recognize the other part of the world that I am in, but not in. So I think I just choose myself in spaces. And there have been many theater awards or accolades or ways that I've been able to do my work where I am the first and the youngest and the only queer Black woman. So I also am struggling with the question because I'm like, sometimes it's the sexist racialized comment. Sometimes it's the racist sex. So I gotta it's never one thing really for me. And it's not just in white institutions. And I keep saying that because we're in this place right now where, and somehow every iteration of the movement, we kind of get to this where it's like, we just need to invest in Black institutions. And that's the answer. And I'm like, cool. We gonna decolonize them too though? Because transphobia and homophobia and still there too, right? So I'm always navigating that, I think, in any space that I am in with all that I am. And so I try to find places that are brave, right? Places where people can sit in the discomfort of being corrected when I feel like giving that energy, or who will go do their own learning, or when I can be in safer spaces, because no place is ever completely safe. We just different. We're people be peopling, right? So including us, we be peopling. So so I am trying to cultivate and sustain safer spaces, brave spaces, and when I do not have those options, I come with all the people before me, so I'm not worried, right? And I think that is a part of what bolsters my ability to sit in being the first or being the only. And knowing that, like my friend C.A. Johnson taught me, we never enter doors alone. So if I'm in here, I'm already bringing, yes, people before me, but people who are here right now in some capacity, so that I'm not walking alone and so that the door doesn't close behind me.
Well, Karina, do you want to have the last word before we close on this question?
It's heavy. I think the one thing that I've tried to do is that what I found in a lot of these white dominated spaces that I occupy and have occupied is that there's this interpretation of a monolith among Black people from white people. I every opportunity that I have, I uplift the stories of other Black women in particular and Black people in this space, because people seem to have a tendency to come, I'm the one who's here, so come to me. Like, what's the answer on this? Give us, the perspective, the Black perspective on this. But I for a time, like I would be like, oh, okay, I would like answer these requests, and then I was like, first of all, I can't speak for all Black people. Nobody can. We know this. This is foundational. But also, like, there have been people who have been doing work in this space much longer than I have, who have stories to share, who have perspectives that I don't have, and I recognize that. And so anytime that anyone's asking for a perspective on anything, it's an opportunity to uplift the collective, to uplift as many perspectives as possible, because there are so many stories to share and so many perspectives and ways of thinking and valuing, spaces and place that need to be brought to the center of the conversation. And so that's essentially the way that not that I care, right? It's not that I care what, the white majority in the places where I am think about me, but any chance that I have to bring other voices into the decision making, into the conversation, that is what I am trying to do.
Well, thank you all. This has been an incredible beginning of the conversation. A good colleague of mine who came from apartheid work in South Africa told me about a story of a game she used to play with her friend, where they would run around in a circle and say, I'm at the beginning of the beginning, the middle of the beginning, the end of the beginning. I'm at the middle of the middle, the middle, the end of the middle. I'm at the beginning of the end, the middle of the end, the end of the end. And like they used to spend all their day running through their town, yelling this back and forth at each other. And I feel like that is where we are. We're at the beginning of a really big and important conversation. So thank you for creating some space for more of the same. Keep being genius. It is my pleasure to moderate Genius, and I will hand it back to Katrina.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first of all of you, thank you so much for coming to this space with us today. For those of you this is your first time attending one of the ACM WEL events, and those of you who have been to our other events physically, because I've seen your names in the chat every week, this is really an embodiment of the intention of the program we present. So if you think about the energy you felt, but also the honesty in terms of the conversation, and also the practicality of the communication. The hope is to have you, our attendees, see yourselves, your experiences, your communities, your concerns, your frustrations, your questions in the work, in the voices, and the faces, and the words of the women, the experts who are leading us in this conversation. So you take it in, you see yourself reflected, you feel energized, and you feel hopeful in terms of, I'm not crazy. There are other people in this world thinking about these issues in similar ways. And now what have they told me? What have they shared that I feel ready to take the next steps in my work and in my life, and how I move through the world and addressing these issues. And a large part of this series was to provide a space before physical, now virtual, in looking or kind of having women who working across these various fields and these spaces in this discipline, rental spaces, and ask the questions, who are you? Why do you do this work? And how do you do this work? And those are three questions that really kind of get to the magnitude of this work. You're really talking about the stewardship, the care, the protection, defense of the communities where we live, of the environment, right? Both the people, not only in terms of, the physical, but the psychological, the emotional, the soul of the world in which we live. And I think it's very important to understand that for many of the women who do this work, you're basically adding to a legacy of stewardship, of care, of conservation, of civic engagement with communities, and the basically the road to justice, right? The questions of justice or lack thereof in the world. And how have communities been addressing these issues, particularly how women been leading in these spaces or leading in efforts to address these ongoing issues of inequality. And I think the work of ACM has always been this idea, okay, so how did we get to this point? How are we sitting here in this space, in this moment? Did we see the world where we were sitting right now? How did this come to be? And how have people always understood that there are ways of moving forward, there are ways of agency, and how do we use their wisdom, their understanding, their knowledge, this community history over time to understand, okay, how do we get this moment? How do we move forward? What has worked? What has not worked? And what are new ways of framing, new ways of expressing the language we need to use to step forward? And so the role really of this programming, as we've always used programs, is how do we get this moment? What's the history of this question, this issue? And then as we make steps to move forward, how do we feel hopeful? How do we feel as though we have the resources and the tools that we need and the knowledge we need to address these critical issues? And if we're talking about environmental issues, I mean, as you said, this is where we live, this is who we are, this is where we pray, where we work, where we play, and so forth. This is all we have, right? And so the question is, what comes in its 20, 30 years? Oh my goodness, we can't stop it, we can't stop it. I think it's important to remember that people have always faced these various issues, and society, okay, we can't face it. People have been facing it, people have been moving forward. And so now how does your work add to this legacy of moving forward, of leaning into the work? I also want to make sure that this work is accessible to you viewing or attending these sessions. These women, yes, you admire them for their expertise, their knowledge, their wisdom, but they're also human beings, live a very human life, and that they're doing this work, and it's possible for you to do this work as well. And so I don't want to have them on a pedestal. I want to have them at a table, on a patio, on a veranda, having tea, coffee, sharing a meal, having a conversation where you see them and you recognize yourself in them and their work. And those, therefore, if they can do this work, then you can do this work as well too. And as ACM, our joy is to document it, right? Have communities understood the realities of their situations, of their lives, how to understand that they're adding to community history. And as once we document it, there was a time, a space, these voices were captured, these images were captured, then we are providing a role as a museum in service to all of its communities. And so I thank you, the panel, thank you, our attendees who've stayed with us over the past month to engage in these conversations. And we plan to continue to engage you. We're planning a series of lectures that we'll post in another week or so, the dates, the times. And we'll also be sharing this video, the chat, and all the resources that we shared today with you. And so once again, thank you so much for sharing your time and knowledge, and just your beautiful Saturday afternoon here in DC. Is gorgeous out, it's warm, it's sunny, somewhat sunny. So for spending a couple hours with us, we really appreciate it. And once again, to our speakers today, I always say this, but it's true every single time. I'm off camera and I'm nodding and I'm clapping, I'm smiling. It's just refreshing to see your passion, your joy, and your hope. And what's the idea, whatever makes you buzz, whatever intrigues you, whatever skill or passion you bring to these various issues, there is space for you in this work. And so I hope today gave you another example of how you can engage in these questions, how you can engage in this work. And it's a human thing. It could be a frustration thing, but also it can be a very joyful thing. And so once again, thank you. And we will be back. Let's see, we're in May. We'll be back in May for a whole new set of lectures. So please take care, be safe, and we'll see you all very shortly. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Katrina and ACM.
Bye, everyone.
Thank y'all.
Wonderful moderating.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
Take care, y'all. Bye.
Take care, everyone. Let's stay in touch.